Hi, it's Jules here. I wanted to add another lunchtime lecture. So the last lunchtime lecture was basically about insulin and how the body uses insulin and what the impact of insulin is in the body and how it leads to weight gain. But there was a lot of information that I left out of that. So this lecture, I want to just add more information on fat and how we get fat, and little things, for example, like how, for example, some people get fat on their tummy and some people get fat on their bum. And of course, important things, how can we get slim again? Just the disclaimer. So the information presented here is for informational purposes only, and it's not intended to diagnose or treat any medical condition. So please consult with your doctor before you make any changes to your health. For those of you who don't know me, I trained initially as a podiatrist, and I still have a private practice where I specialize in diabetics and arthritic conditions. I have a degree in psychology and communication. I studied kinesiology, healing modalities, exercise science and sports restoration therapy, health and nutrition from the UK, functional medicine from the United States, and my sub-studies include detoxification, hormones and sexual health, insulin, of course, stroke, and how all of this ties in with our genetics. So how can we get fat? We get fat by firstly eating more than our energy requirements. So we've got more food coming in than our basal metabolic rate can handle. Then the capacity of our liver and our muscles is exceeded, and our body can only store the added calories coming in the form of fat. We also get fat when we don't give our liver time to deplete the stored glucose, in other words, the stored glycogen. When we don't give our liver time to deplete it, in other words, we don't give enough time in between eating, the saturation of the glucose in the liver is never depleted. So then when we do eat, or let's say we have a binge day, our body just has nowhere to store those added calories but as fat. We get fat when we don't exercise because, of course, exercising depletes the stored glycogen in the muscle. So then when we eat again, or let's say we have a binge day, then the body's got a little bit of space in the muscle to store the excess calories if we are somebody who exercises. And the excessive flow of hormones makes a big difference, and I am going to discuss hormones in a little bit more detail. We did discuss hormones or discuss insulin in great detail in the last lecture, so if you want to refer back to that, I will put a link at the top and you can refer back to that. But otherwise, there are other hormones that play a role. So when we eat too much, there's too many calories coming in, and liver and muscles are saturated. The excess calories can only go into fat storage. And over time, we're going to slowly add on more and more and more kilos. And then certainly as we get older, and now we've got the hormones are playing a greater role, then it's even harder to lose weight. Now, if we know that adding too many calories makes us fat, then why doesn't the reverse apply? So why then, if we're cutting calories, how come we don't lose weight? Or we lose maybe 1 or 2 kilos and then we plateau out and we're just not losing any more weight. And there's a very logical reason to this. It's all about our hormones and how our body, the hormones influence the body's ability to utilize fats or store fats. And the big hormones are insulin, leptin, and cortisol and adrenaline. And again, in the previous lunchtime lecture, we discussed insulin in great detail. Now, the additional complications on losing weight, repeated high-carb meals affect your hormones negatively. So 6 small meals a day. It has been suggested that 6 small meals a day balance your insulin, and that to some extent is true. But the problem is that it balances insulin when there is already too much insulin in the body. So it's balancing it, but at a high level. And as long as you've got insulin in your blood, the message to your body is store energy and not lose energy. Insulin resistance, as I discussed in the previous lunchtime lecture, leptin resistance, which we're going to discuss now. And then what happens is that if we are cutting calories, our energy levels plummet. And of course, if our energy levels plummet, our urge to exercise is also going to disappear. So the influencing factors are our hormones and we need to look at what hormones specifically regulate fat. So in other words, regulate whether our body's going to hold on to fat or whether it's going to be able to burn it more easily. Exercise, how much difference does exercise actually make? And our genes play a role. And if you think about it, if you think of a greyhound doesn't matter how much it eats, it's always lean with high energy. Whereas a basset hound, probably if you give a basset hound a tiny amount of food, the basset hound is still going to be fat and sluggish. And the same concepts are going to apply to humans as well with regard to how our body utilizes fats. Stress is a big player, and toxins, enzymes, and malnutrition, in other words, poor food choices, also influence whether or not, number one, we actually gain fat quickly, and number two, whether or not we're able to lose it. And just to touch on toxins briefly, if you are very toxic, your body stores the toxins in fat, and your body is all about survival. So if you've got toxins stored as fat, and you then lose weight, and the fat, basically the bonds break up, and the fat is now released, the toxins are released as well. And the body obviously doesn't want those toxins reaching our primary organs. So it's going to hold on to the fat if you are very toxic. So let's talk a little bit more about the hormones. We have already addressed insulin, but the primary hormones, the fat-making hormones, are insulin, leptin, and cortisol. And every single one of us has some control over the impact that these hormones have because they're external triggers. Now, too much insulin and fat, really too much insulin promotes fat storage. Remember I said to you in the previous lunchtime lecture that when you have insulin in your blood, the message to your body is store energy. And the body uses two enzymes, lipoprotein lipase and hormone-sensitive lipase, to regulate whether the fat's going into the cell or whether the fat's able to go out of the cell. And insulin influences both of these hormones. And you'll see as I go into that, too much insulin has a negative influence on both lipoprotein lipase and hormone-sensitive lipase. So lipoprotein lipase works outside the cell. So if you were to imagine you've got your cell membranes and you've got these little receptors, almost like little prickly bits sticking out, and insulin stimulates lipoprotein lipase. But what happens with lipoprotein lipase, it actually sucks in any circulating fat from the blood into the cell. So lipoprotein lipase pulls fat into the cell. So it's going to make you fatter. And certain areas have got more lipoprotein lipase than other, and this is a genetic thing. So, and this is why, for example, some people might have more lipoprotein lipase on their bottom. So they've got very round bums, but are very slim otherwise. And some people might have more lipoprotein lipase on their stomach, for example. And because lipoprotein lipase pulls fat from the circulating blood into the cell, where there's more lipoprotein lipase, you're going to be fatter. And it's also, lipoprotein lipase is sensitive to estrogen and testosterone. So, for example, men with their testosterone, when their testosterone drops off, lipoprotein lipase pulls more fat into their gut. So how it does this is it actually breaks the bonds of the triglycerides into fatty acids, because a triglyceride is actually too large a molecule to get into the cell. But lipoprotein lipase almost dissolves that molecule into smaller fatty acids, and these small fatty acids can flow into the cell. So that's what I mean by pulling the fat into the cell, because it breaks the fat up into a size that can actually flow in. Now, hormone-sensitive lipase is different. Hormone-sensitive lipase works inside the cell. Now, let me just go back to lipoprotein lipase. Insulin stimulates lipoprotein lipase, so it makes lipoprotein lipase more active. On the other hand, insulin suppresses hormone-sensitive lipase. Now, because hormone-sensitive lipase works inside the cell, it allows you to lose fat. So when you've got hormone-sensitive lipase inside the cell, it breaks down the same triglycerides that are formed inside the cell, and it allows them to flow out of the fat cell so that the body can then use them in the mitochondria as an energy source. So the fatty acids are broken down from the inside of the fat cell using the hormone-sensitive lipase. They can flow out of the storage fat cell, and they are then they can then flow into the mitochondria to be burned as fuel. So when hormone-sensitive lipase is low, the fat cannot be burned, and insulin suppresses hormone-sensitive lipase. So in summary, insulin stimulates lipoprotein lipase, which makes us fatter, and it suppresses hormone-sensitive lipase, so we cannot burn fat. So this is how insulin's message to the cell is store energy. It takes the sugar into the cell, it bonds with the fatty acids, that forms the triglyceride, and the triglyceride is a bigger molecule, and this obviously plays a role in whether or not it can either flow into the cell or out of the cell. So insulin is an anabolic hormone. It builds things. So when you want to lose weight, you need to bring down your insulin. So insulin is the first hormone to get under control when we want to lose weight. And of course, we can do this ourselves. And you can see from the previous lunchtime lecture how we can go about doing this. But from this, you can see how very, very important it is to keep your insulin levels low when you're wanting to lose weight. So what are the causes of high insulin? The first one is lots of glucose in the blood, and you have a higher glucose content in the blood if you've been eating a lot of carbs. And remember, vegetables are also carbs, but they don't spike insulin the way that bread or pasta or potatoes, obviously sweets and biscuits and sugar in your tea and all that are going to spike your insulin. Vegetable carbs, generally because they're high in fiber, don't spike your insulin. But fruit sugar, so fruit does spike your insulin. So the first thing is eating lots of carbs. The second is eating too frequently. So if you're eating 6 small meals a day, you're going to be spiking your carbohydrates, and then you're going to spike your insulin. High cortisol. Cortisol is a hormone that your body releases during times of stress. In fact, it's cortisol and adrenaline. And cortisol, what it does is it causes a release of stored sugar from the muscles into the blood. And it's because the body's not sure in the fight or flight response, the parasympathetic stimulation, whether or not you're going to need to run. So it releases the sugar, so you've got energy to do this. Insulin resistance, of course, creates high insulin in the blood. Diabetic medication. So when you're given, if you're diabetic, whether you're type 1 or type 2. Type 1 generally has different parameters, so I'm just going to address type 2. Type 2 diabetes is normally a result of too much insulin, the constant release of insulin from the pancreas. Now, if you are on something like glucophage, glucophage does increase the absorption of the glucose into the cell. So really what it does is it forces the insulin to carry the glucose into the cell. But the problem with that is that from a short-term perspective, it works very well. But from a long-term perspective, you're not addressing what was the reason that you actually had high glucose in the blood in the first place, or high insulin in the blood in the first place. So the fact that diabetic medication overrides that is not beneficial long term. The other thing is that if you transition from something like metformin, which is glucophage, onto insulin, insulin makes you fat, because now you've got insulin injections, and the increase in insulin in your blood is going to increase the response with lipoprotein lipase and hormone-sensitive lipase. And then the last one is parasympathetic stimulation. So in other words, your stress response. All of these cause an increase in insulin. If you can reduce your insulin, obviously one of the effects is it's going to increase your success in losing weight. It lowers your blood pressure because high insulin causes the kidneys to retain salt, retain sodium. And insulin reduction is going to temporarily increase your triglycerides. Now, this is because of the response from the hormone-sensitive lipase and the lipoprotein lipase. Because if, for example, you are the hormone-sensitive lipase is allowing the fat from the fat cells to flow out of the cells, and you're losing weight, initially the fat has to go somewhere, so it's going to go into your blood. So if, for example, you did have your cholesterol checked, don't be alarmed if you find your triglycerides are temporarily increased. And of course, when your insulin is reduced and you're not getting that message of a store energy, you're going to have increased use of fat for energy, which of course is what we want to do. So without a primary control on insulin, it is impossible to sustain your weight loss. Calorie cutting with poor food choices. So in other words, when you're looking at low-cal foods, they're usually low in nutrient density as well. So your body can be functionally starving, even though you might be just coming in on the amount of calories for, I suppose, for basic survival. But if you're choosing foods that still trigger your insulin, you're going to be unsuccessful. So you can calorie cut, choose foods that still trigger insulin, and you're going to have all the disadvantages of calorie cutting with none of the benefits. So in the long term, calorie cutting is unsuccessful. And I'm going to address this in the next lecture. I actually want to keep these lunchtime lectures a little bit shorter, so I'm going to do a part 2 on this, and we will address calorie cutting specifically in part 2. So an overview of insulin. It keeps your blood sugar controlled. In other words, insulin takes the glucose into the cell out of the blood. It promotes fat storage with lipoprotein lipase. It promotes protein storage in muscle, so if you're bodybuilding, insulin is going to be beneficial to you. It promotes the salt retention in the kidneys. I addressed that, so your blood pressure is going to go up. It suppresses hormone-sensitive lipase, and that's the one that breaks down the triglycerides into fatty acids so they can flow out of the fat, so your body can actually burn them. So that's definitely a disadvantage. It triggers lipoprotein lipase. This is the enzyme that promotes fat storage on fat cells, so it causes more fat to flow into the fat cells. And it suppresses lipoprotein lipase on the muscle cell. And basically what this means is that your body, even if you're exercising, the muscles aren't going to burn the fat directly. And insulin triggers sugar burning in the muscles and not fat burning. So it pulls sugar into the fat cells and it increases the glycerol to bind with the fatty acids. So basically it's making you fatter. What we're going to address in part 2, we're going to address more information on fat. And in the next lecture, I'm going to address leptin resistance and how this relates to getting fatter. I'm going to address the effects of a calorie-restricted diet. We're going to look at the fact that hunger is your enemy. We're going to do some reality checks. In other words, perhaps some real-life examples on how people get fat in the first place and the difficulty in losing weight. And then in part 3, which will be the third lecture, we're going to look at intermittent fasting and how to do intermittent fasting. So really, you can see from this, I'm not, in fact, in favor of calorie-restricted diets. So to contact me, you can contact me on health@liveto100.co.za. You can go to the website to subscribe at www.liveto100.co.za. And if you need additional support for your unique body, contact me.